Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk About Cities, a podcast dedicated to making complex topics in urban planning and architecture more accessible.
Today we'll talk about participatory planning, why it's relevant, its benefits, as well as its potential risks and obstacles. I'm Matthias.
And I'm Katharina. Let's talk about cities.
We like to start with definitions. So, Katarina, how about you give us a definition of what participatory planning is?
Yeah, I'd love to. I'm not a huge fan of reading out the Wikipedia definition, but maybe I can start with it. Wikipedia defines participatory planning as, and now I'm quoting, an urban planning paradigm that emphasizes involving the entire community in the strategic and management processes of urban planning or community level planning processes, urban or rural. And then it goes on, but I think that kind of gives a good overview. And also, if you know the word participatory and planning, I think you can imagine what it's all about.
Yeah.
But can we just, I'd like to talk about why participation in planning in general is considered relevant, and maybe take the chance to actually look back a bit in planning history, how it's been, that it's not always been like it is now, because it feels like participation in planning processes nowadays is a must. And maybe we can kind of elaborate on how it's been before and that it's not always been the case like that.
Yeah, so let's start with the basic forms of participation as they've existed for the longest time. There are in most democratic countries forms of participation embedded within the official planning processes. And that's been the case, depending on the country, for about 70 or 80 years. So just before the Second World War or just after. And those forms of participation usually take the form of consultation processes, which means that when a plan has been developed by the municipality, then it's displayed to the public, either traditionally in the municipal offices or in the mayor's office. Then when the plans, zoning plans, for example, have been displayed, then people with an interest, so be it organizations that are in some way affected by the plan or citizens who are affected by it, can give their opinions on it. And then the plan can either be changed based on those views that have been presented, or it can go through anyway. So that's a particular sort of level of participation, and we'll get to the levels of participation because there are different definitions of that, and there are different methods of participation, a lot of different ones that in roughly the last 60 years have been developed. And we won't go through all of those. We will just try to establish a sort of theoretical foundation for how to understand and talk about participation in this episode.
But maybe, I agree that I don't think that we can have time to go through all of them, but maybe you can quickly go over how it's been in the 40s or so, how the common planning path was.
Yeah, well, the change that has been made, and it's not really true to say that a change has been made as such, as a finished transformation of the process of planning. But traditionally, to me, I would connect the emergence of participatory planning with the movement from modernity to postmodernity. And with that, I mean modernity in the sense of the time period since the Enlightenment in which rationality has been the supreme ruler. It's been one of the highest values. And that has led to a situation where knowledge in the rational sense is what gives authority and power to someone. And that means that in planning, for example, as in many other spheres, experts have a lot of power. And you can see that as well in planning, how it's for a long time been about the lone genius architect or planner sort of making a master plan, as the word also implies, that it's a master at work.
And then also, sorry to interrupt, but then also really this top-down view as opposed to what we're craving for now, bottom up, actually working with the people. But then what is being criticized from back then is also that, as you say, this lonesome planner that knows it all, kind of, and he looks up from bird's eye perspective, or like top down.
Exactly. And not only that, there's the process and sort of the power relation of that, but also the results that come from that. Because obviously modernity, or in planning and architectural terms, modernism had ideas or birthed ideas such as form follows function, or Le Corbusier's idea that cities and buildings are like machines and should be designed and optimized like machines. And this leads to a certain aesthetic and focus on function. But that was then criticized in a reflection on both this process and the values within the process, and also the power relations. And actually one of the most influential critics was Jane Jacobs, who walked around the streets of New York and wrote about how complex the communities are, and how that has to take more place, the complexity of the communities and also their knowledge of their surroundings and their everyday lives, and how that has to matter more in planning.
Exactly. But she wasn't really respected, as she was not an educated planner, right? So
that, and she was a woman, and it was in the 60s. She wrote the book The Death and Life of Great American Cities in 1961, and wasn't an educated planner, and she was a woman in the 60s. So for that reason, but also because she was very critical, she really attacked people like Le Corbusier and Robert Moses, who was the chief planner of New York at the time. And therefore, I think planners took it as an attack on their authority. And therefore, she was also very strongly discredited, shall we say. But so that was one of the first one. And then Christopher Alexander, in his 1965 book, A City is Not a Tree, looked at this understanding of the city as, he says, a tree, because to him the modernistic understanding of a city was one in which there are several different parts with their own function, and they are linked, but they are not interlinked. In the idea of a tree, you have the main trunk, and then you have the branches going out, and then smaller branches from these branches. But these small branches connected to the trunk are not connected between one another, except through the trunk. So actually they become isolated. And his point was that a city and the systems of a city are more like a lattice. So where you have connections going, crisscrossing and going through in a very complex way. And his further point about this was that such a complex system cannot be understood by a lone genius or by a small group of experts. It really requires
a lot of knowledge,
input,
also,
input, informal input, and a more sort of flexible understanding of knowledge.
Yeah. Also, I think we should maybe say, I don't know if that is clear, that if you said the tree, that he said that doesn't work with when the branches are not interconnected. I think back at that time, when you think about someone planning top down, and then maybe drawing those very straight lines, those are usually for the cars, and they're quite simple and make a lot of sense from looking at the plan from above. But then when you're actually on the street and you see those dimensions that are not very human friendly and not very nice to, or maybe not very interesting to walk around, then you might understand that this creates totally different neighborhoods and strongly influences, of course, how people move around. And then this also plays a role. So there's so many things attached to that maybe might not be visible at the first place when talking about this problematic or
exactly. And that was the critique basically from Alexander, was more towards the process, and from Jane Jacobs was more about who was involved. But they both sort of meant that that's not a good way to do it, basically. And then there's
they criticize the outcome basically, but for a different
and the process. But then there's Henri Lefebvre, who
Henri Lefebvre.
Henri Lefebvre. So then there was Henri Lefebvre, who was a French professor and philosopher and sociologist, and he approached the planning of cities, and wider yet what he called the production of space, as a matter of power and control, first and foremost. And he says that space is a social construction which itself shapes social practice and perception. And so there's a back and forth relationship there. The social construction, that is space, shapes the social practice and perception, and the social practice and perception then shapes the space. And he was also critical to capitalism, and he argued that within capitalism, the spaces produced are based on exchange value over use value. It's a symptom of commodification. And therefore, they will always reproduce capitalist social relations of production, meaning those with power will create spaces that keep them in power. So that just perpetuates a hierarchical power structure and basically the hegemonic domination of the thoughts and actions of citizens. Because to Lefebvre, the everyday life was very important, meaning not just when you're at work or the overall narrative of your life and what you do, but your everyday life, how you make very small decisions within your day. And he meant that has to be reflected in the city. There has to be a synthesis, he called it, between everyday life and the city. And for that to happen, every citizen has a fundamental right to the city. Now, the right to the city has been understood and presented as the right to use the city, or to be in and act in the city, to access the urban resources in the city. But really what I think Lefebvre meant was the right to the city is that, but it's more, it's also a right to participate in the production of the city, in the production of space. And so that's what we'll look at after we presented the topic of participatory planning. It's, it can go very deep in what that really means. So looking at that definition of the right to the city and production of space, is it really enough with a sort of consultation where you can give your view on a plan that has already been designed? That's kind of the questions.
I completely agree. And I think, first of all, I think it's nice that you kind of walked us through those milestones now, because they maybe some of them happen at the same time or close to each other. But as you said before, also, this was not a quick, rapid change. Rather, few people were questioning how it's been done, and then questioning it more and more. And then it kind of changed over a quite long period of time.
Yeah, exactly.
Into what it is today.
I mean, all those texts were written in the 60s. Jane Jacobs' book was 61.
Yeah.
Christopher Alexander's in 65 and Lefebvre's in 68. And 68, everyone knows. And the student revolts and in France, where he lived. And the 60s in general were a time where power structures were being questioned. so it was all of that was within a greater context, also outside of planning, of questioning power structures. So that's the context. And then there's Sherry Arnstein, who published an essay in 1961 called A Ladder of Citizen Participation. And in that, she presented a model which helps understand the different degrees, the different levels, or actually, therefore, the metaphor of a ladder, rungs of participation. And so that starts to help the analysis that has become, through those aforementioned 3 books, really a pertinent topic. But it makes it a bit more easy to understand which different degrees or levels of participation are there, and how can they be used in a constructive sense, but also how can they be abused by power holders.
Yeah, because I think that is kind of where we are today. It's a bit like the term sustainability that, could we say social washing, or I don't know, it feels like...
Window dressing, I think is the...
Okay, apparently there's a term for it. That whenever you have participated in a planning process or whatever process really, it seems like it's kind of bulletproof, or politicians would like to think that. Because they can always say, well, we have asked the people and we have talked to them. And then, yeah, you did. But if you didn't take them seriously, then what's the point really?
Exactly.
But I think before going into that, I would kind of go back to why participation is relevant, because I think you have touched upon that quite a lot now when walking us through the history. As you said, there was this one oftentimes powerful man that was deciding. And I think that is kind of the whole point of participation, that, we as planners or architects, landscape architects, get educated to look through different lenses and try to think about, okay, how would that work for a person sitting in a wheelchair, for example? However, there are some things that, if you haven't lived it, maybe you don't have I'm quite sure you don't have the same perception. And therefore, if, for example, you have a park that is specifically designed for blind people, then I would like to see someone who actually is blind involved in the planning process, because they most certainly know what is needed for them. And that's kind of my point also, that if you only have a certain group of people within the planning committee or the decision makers, it's quite obvious that a certain output will be there.
So that's a look at why it's relevant based on the outcome. Yeah. And what I was talking about was rather a look behind that and sort of more fundamental reasons for why it's needed, right? With
the right to the city, you mean?
Yes, for example, and the power relations involved. So, but you can look at it from different ways, obviously, and argue from different directions. I think that's the way to do it, because none of them is right or true. There's no such thing. But the important thing, I think, is that there's a discussion and a will to improve both the outcomes, but also the processes and the level of involvement of the public, basically the transparency and the democracy.
Yeah.
And precisely this discussion, I believe, is important, because a lot of participation or a lot of participatory methods or processes aim at consensus. And that's another risk that I would mention, that if you always look to compromise or find a consensus that everyone agrees with, then it's quite likely that something is being pushed under the rug, namely contentious perspectives and conflicts, which are, I believe, something that is important not to hide.
Mm. And actually, if we start to be a bit critical about what can go wrong in planning processes, I think it is also quite a challenge when oftentimes there's only a certain group of people being interested, or that maybe only a certain group of people that are invited in a participatory planning process are actually coming. And that could be because they don't have time, or maybe they don't have interest, or maybe lacking skills. Like it could be whatever.
Exactly.
But oftentimes the reality is that those planning processes or those participatory workshops or whatever it is often on a Wednesday at 3 p.m. And then a lot of people work there, and or maybe if they don't want to spend their time in some workshop room. So I think
exactly, even within involvement, there is exclusion. Basically, it's the same as we talked about in the episode about self-initiated housing, where a lot of those Baugruppen, in the end, are actually only available to certain demographics.
Precisely.
And to others not.
I also think oftentimes nowadays I see more and more visualization tools being involved in a participatory planning process that require certain digital skills that many might not have. And I think that's also that could be a barrier for many people. I mean, still, it's nice to, for example, if you're trying to redo a street and you show the people how it could look like with more trees or with a different pavement or whatever, and then maybe you'll have a augmented reality for that, or you use augmented reality for that to show how it could be. Maybe some people are completely overwhelmed with that. I don't know. I think it's just really hard to find a way that works for all those different people. And
you're not gonna.
And ages.
And I think that's the issue I have with a focus on consensus, because you're not going to be able to cover all the bases. And so therefore, first of all, it's important to acknowledge that and not use a rhetoric of actually ticking all the boxes just because it looks or sounds good. You have to acknowledge that there in any process there are flaws, and then try to do your best. And so then there will be best practices of examples that work really well, and then there will be other methods that perhaps don't work so well, but they will be very neatly packaged and sold basically as working well, because it benefits someone somewhere in the process that it's done in that way.
Yeah, and I think that's also important to talk about, that when a participatory process is done properly, it actually can be a lot more socially sustainable, in that sense that people are actually on board with what you're doing, because and maybe they also have a sense of ownership. Now I'm thinking about my revitalization of the street example again. And maybe, you set up some kind of care plan for planters that you've put there, and then people can help out with that. And then maybe they feel some kind of ownership about that and try to take care. And I think that if you're involving people in such a sense and actually talking to them what they want, there's a whole different kind of feeling within those micro neighborhoods then. And therefore also a lot more sustainable. So I think if it's done properly, it really helps the whole process, and just makes it a lot more valuable for everyone. So that's in the perfect world when everything works out. But as we said before, there are also obstacles to participatory planning. And before I mentioned lack of skill set from the citizens, but actually it could also be from the people, from the planners, because they just do that to participate but don't really know how. So I think that could also be an obstacle. And what I often find is lack of transparency, because oftentimes you write down wishes on some post-its, but you don't know what's going to happen with that.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then, everyone writes more trees and I don't know, more seating area, but it feels like oftentimes I think might become very frustrating for people if they don't know in what way their opinions are being taken into account. And that holds the risk of them not participating in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think and there are even greater risks to that, namely that if you don't feel that your input that you do give is valued, then that sort of weakens the foundation of democracy in general.
Exactly.
It's not just the question of if you will actually participate again.
Yeah.
But there are lots of examples like that. And I'd really like to recommend that any listener looks up that essay, A Ladder of Citizen Participation from Sherry Arnstein, because she also gives very good explanations of, well, her model, and for each of these 8 levels that she presents, from basically empty rituals to citizen control in the last stage. And she also gives examples of how those may be used or abused by power holders.
Now I wonder, do you know any example where you feel like citizens actually were in control?
Yeah, actually I heard about one today, which I thought was quite a large degree of control. There's one, I think my favorite example is Christiania in Copenhagen, which is what's basically called a free town. And it came out of an occupation of an area in Copenhagen. And obviously there have been many occupations, and in some other cases I think as well, it's in the end led to a sort of those occupations being made official. For example, we heard recently about this example in Amsterdam of a former squatter's house that was then turned into
student
housing with the help of the municipality. But anyway, in Christiania, it came out of a struggle with squatters taking over the area in the 70s, I think. And there were struggles, and the police tried to clear it. But over time, the municipality and the authorities had to realize that they couldn't keep going on in that antagonistic way. So they had to start to tolerate that area is in fact there and has some degree of citizen control. But then I also heard about an example today about a skate park here in Malmö where we live, in Stapelbäddsparken, where Malmö has a subculture of skaters that's quite large and well known, and there was an association of skaters who wanted a new place to skate, so they had their minds on a place outside the city on the periphery, but then during the planning of a park in Västra Hamnen, a larger development area, they were taken in and offered the chance to build a skate park there. And the point is that it was in the end financed by the municipality, but the members of the skaters association, so the skaters themselves, both decided what should be built and how it should be built, and then actually literally built it with their own hands.
Crazy.
So I think that's a really nice example. And then the upkeep of that has been continuously financed by the municipality, and I think that's a really nice example.
And it's very liked. Like whenever I go, besides that, there's super many people, both children and adults.
Yeah, and it's also led to the success of that project has led to a further project. The park is called Stapelbäddsparken, and then there's an association called Stapel that are then in a building, so it's become like a culture association, kind of recreating that same model.
Just before, I know that you want to talk about Superkilen, right? But I think before, what I want to say also is that when it's such a successful process, you almost have like many representatives of that, and they're just proud of their projects, and they talk about to friends and family, and it's almost like little testimonials or something for a project, in a good way though. And I think that community engagement, if you actually, also give them money to do stuff, then it can work out really nicely for everyone. And that's exactly...
Of course, that's another obstacle oftentimes, that there's a lack of money. So then you can't even start.
Yeah. And often, and I think that is one last thing that I want to say about obstacles is, and that might be an unpopular opinion, but I think that you also have to be careful as a planner to not lose your role as an expert, in a sense that it's very important and valuable to work together with citizens and the community, because they just have a huge knowledge about the site maybe, or a certain topic. But also, I think one should not blindly do whatever the community wants, because I found myself in participatory processes where a lot of people owning shops, for example, participated in. And then all they said in this whole workshop was that they didn't want to get rid of any parking spots because they're afraid that it might damage their business, because less people then come to their shops. And then at least what we learned or I learned in my studies was that there's many examples of streets being turned into pedestrian streets, and it actually helps the local shops a lot, because people like to walk around and stay there longer and so on. So citizens also lack a certain kind of planning knowledge, and I think it's also okay to know, or it's important to know when to involve and then base your decisions on that.
Well, yeah, that's a really good example, because there are several ways to look at that. One would be, well, hey, if you invite the people to give you their views, then even if they're not in accordance with yours based on what you've learned, should you then discard them, or is there sort of an imperative to take them on board anyway? Yeah. But that depends entirely on the model, of course. And then the other thing I think is that in such a case, then it might be necessary to have this dialogue with them, and not just to discard their views, but to say, well, actually, your goal is to have more revenue for your business. And here, let me show you the studies and the other examples, because examples can be very powerful, where actually getting rid of the parking spots has led to a higher revenue. And basically make a promise of higher revenue. And I'm quite sure that then will convince them to go with that. So,
it's for sure learning from each other.
Yeah.
But go on. Tell us about Superkilen.
I get to talk about Superkilen. Super. Very nice. Well, we've been there a couple of times, and I think it's also very well known. You see it oftentimes on social media being shared. It's very colorful. It's very striking visually. It's kind of 2/3 square and 1/3 park in Copenhagen in Denmark. And it was designed by Big, Bjarke Ingels Group, Topotech One from Berlin, and the Danish art collective Superflex. And it's located in a multicultural district called Nørrebro. And just next to this park or square, there's a neighborhood designated by the Danish government as a ghetto. Maybe you've heard about how they designate areas as ghettos and then try to get at them. So they've identified there an issue with integration of migrants to Denmark within the Danish society. And so for this project, Superflex asked people living in the area that represent over 50 different countries which objects they would like to have in the park rather than the normal street and park furniture. And so that was their idea of participation that would reflect the identity of the very multicultural, diverse area that they were planning in. And so that led to over 100 objects from these more than 50 countries. And they are either from the respondents' country of origin or from somewhere where they have traveled to. And
can you maybe say some examples?
Yeah, there's like a donut sign from the US, a dentist sign from Qatar. There's a basketball hoop from Somalia, a fountain from Morocco, palm trees from China, a trash can from Liverpool, stuff like that. And then Superflex also employed a process which they call extreme participation. So that sounds very interesting. What's that? That means that Superflex traveled with 5 groups to 5 different countries. And from each country, they retrieved an object from there to bring to Superkilen, to the project, and place it there. And for example, there's soil from Palestine. So in the park part of Superkilen, there's kind of a grassy hill or a knoll, and a part of it is kind of sandy, and there's the soil from Palestine. So that might sound really nice, like here the identity and diversity is being represented, but honestly, to me it's also a bit kitschy. You know, it reminds me, with all these different artifacts from different countries taken out of their context, it reminds me of the Strip in Las Vegas with, you know, the Eiffel Tower and pyramids and so on.
I have to say, I think that's nice.
Yeah.
Every time I hear the, you know, where you press for the traffic light,
Yeah.
it's the same as in Vienna, and it always makes me feel a bit more at home somehow. So,
Okay.
but I also understand what you mean by kitsch, but go on.
I mean, I think it is very kitsch, and there we go back to me to this switch from modernity to post-modernity, because then it becomes all about images. So it's not about how you use this park and how you live your life as an immigrant in Denmark, or actually your identity. This, going back to the everyday life of Lefebvre, it's just objects.
It's very Instagrammable somehow.
Yeah, and it's kind of images claiming to represent something much deeper. But there's another aspect to the story of Superkilen as well, which is that this rhetoric, you know, extreme participation, sounds fantastic, but then the will was to move away from the municipal consultations that are an established tool. So with this extreme participation, but there were already citizens' initiatives in that area before the park was even designed. So there were already bottom-up movements that wanted to change things, and they were just ignored by the municipality. So that's what I meant earlier with kind of sweeping things under a rug, where there are conflicts and differing ideas, and then you kind of take something where you claim to have found consensus and present it as a panacea, you know, a cure for all. And the next thing is that the project was in the end funded by a private organization. So it's not funded by the city. It doesn't, it's in that sense not coming from you know, a public initiative. It was funded by a private organization called Real Dania, that are very powerful in Denmark. They have a lot of money, and they create projects and basically have become almost a parallel structure to the municipal authority on planning. And they obviously, being the funders, could decide what happens and what doesn't happen. So if something was proposed that wasn't to their liking, they could just say, no, we're not going to fund it then. Right. So the next thing is that these citizens that participated and gave their wishes for the objects were selected. So it wasn't an open call for inhabitants of the district to participate, but it was a select group, a closed group. So I don't know how you get extreme participation from that.
How do you know? Do you know how they've been selected?
Yeah, there had been like consultation groups already working with the municipality in the area, but not these citizens' initiatives, but consultation groups. And so from these consultation groups, people who already had worked with the municipality were selected to give their wishes. So my point is that there actually isn't an empowering moment in this process. To me, it's really a sort of representation of an empowering moment that, when you look beyond it,
actually isn't.
So
also basic things like they were wishing for trees or like shade, but there's barely any trees.
That's
right?
supposedly as well. I mean, most people wanted a park, but as I said, it's 2/3 square and 1/3 park, and it gets very hot in summer, for example. And the park part also doesn't have very many trees or so. It's not very green either. There have been issues with the materials used and so on, but I think it's not really necessary to get into that right now, because the issue is of the participation and how that's been sold, as a process and as an outcome. But actually it's a privatization of not just public space, but the production of space. So if we go back to Lefebvre again, instead of citizens being involved in the production of space, it's not even anymore the municipality, which is the democratic representation of the citizens, but actually private organization. So it's a privatization of the production of space. And I think that's something to view very critically, and very critically you should also view, I think, how the project has been represented in architectural journals and on social media, because it's quite clear that this strategy has worked. It's being sold as a fantastic example of participation and of urban design. And furthermore, something we haven't even mentioned is that this park has led to not only this park, but in no small part, this park has led to the gentrification of the area, which was a diverse, cheap area and increasingly is getting quite unaffordable. So to me, you have all the hallmarks of a hostile process and a hostile project being sold as something good for the people. It's almost like, old slum clearing projects in the US.
Very true. And I think you could rant on for
I
quite
could, but
a
I
lot
don't
of
mean
time.
to rant, and that's why I also wanted to mention that the skate park. There's another example actually that I wanted to mention just to end on a positive note.
Let's do that, and then we can wrap up.
So there's Jubileumsparken in Gothenburg, which was an example of where it was already decided that a former harbor area in Gothenburg was to be redeveloped, and there was a general plan already established, but it was quite abstract. And in that plan was an area earmarked for a park. So before the development really got going or took place, the municipality of Gothenburg wanted to try a new method, namely to work with prototypes of structures for public activities. So it's not entirely new, but this idea of starting to create the identity of an area before it's developed, so that there's not a clean slate and it's not just impersonal development and speculation. So then what they did was they had a lot of workshops, open calls for people to take part, and they could wish for what they wanted to have. And then in the case of a public sauna, for example, the Berlin firm Raumlabor was invited to design it. And in other cases, they through these workshops could take part in the designing and again, the literal building themselves. So that, I think, is a really nice example, because it's kind of a very open method of participation. But I think that too can be criticized, because then the question is again, who actually comes to these workshops and whose ideas end up being replicated. And furthermore, that particular method of trying to create an identity for an area before you develop it can also be viewed as quite a cynical attempt to raise the value of what you then develop. So you actually use the energy and time and creativity of citizens to raise the value of the area, which means that when it's finally built and developed around what you've done in public space, the people living there and being able to take part will not be the same ones that that actually helped develop it?
Depends. I mean, Jubileumsparken and the sauna there is for free, right?
Yeah, of course it depends.
So,
but then the question is, who will go there when it's built up and it's rather a residential area? And I didn't mean to say that that's definitely the case, or that will happen or has to happen. But I'm saying that there's a risk.
Yeah.
So that even such actually seemingly a positive example of participation again has to be viewed critically. I think that's the final point, you know, in a way, to see always who is involved, who has the possibility to be involved, and with what aim, and to which degree does that involvement actually end up in the decision making as well.
So it also, to wrap up, it also craves a lot of skills from the people planning and like leading those workshops, because it's a really fine line how to do this properly. And I guess there's also not one right way, but as you said, one has to be critical about it, and there are lots of dangers. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we're as always very happy about any feedback or comments or questions you have.
Let's talk about cities.